Tucker Carlson has been doing two different kinds of rebranding at the same time. The substantive sort of rebranding is that every year his show is more explicitly meant to appeal to white nationalists. He pushes their narratives, he brings on their guests, he talks about their literature and all of that. But he does want to cloak that. And so he is trying to build up this aura of him being some sort of reasonable populist throughout this year. And it has actually tricked some people. Earlier this year, I got to talk with Parker Malloy of Media Matters, who came on after doing quite a bit of analysis on her own right of Tucker Carlson's attempt to appeal to a new audience. Here's that interview. You basically wrote that he is a master at the art of misdirection. Could you explain your thesis for our audience?
Sure. So one of the things that I've kind of noticed is so Tucker Carlson on his show, a lot of times he will talk about the ruling class. He likes to blame things on the ruling class, which is fair. You know, we do have a ruling class, as all societies do, but he never elaborates on what he really means by that. So a few weeks ago, I started reading his book, which talks about how the ruling class is destroying America, basically. And he doesn't get into it there so much either. So I started watching clip after clip after clip of his show, especially the ones where he will say something that progressives will kind of nod our heads to, thinking, yes, this makes sense. And you see sometimes he'll get, he'll get praise, like, what was it? Vox wrote something. Vox had a story that said, last Wednesday, the conservative talk show host started a fire on the right after airing a prolonged monologue on his show that was, in essence, an indictment of American capitalism. Now, that sounds progressive. That sounds kind of awesome. And if you listen to what he's saying, it sometimes can sound that way, the way he'll talk about taxes or the way he'll talk about Amazon, for instance. But one thing I always find when I watch these segments is they'll start out talking about something like that, a real problem in the world, like why is the tax code so complex, or why do tech companies like Facebook continue to pump out products that they know are potentially harmful and are addictive by design. And so he'll make these good points, but then he'll come to some sort of really bonkers conclusion. He'll talk about how the suicide rate for men is too high, and then he'll end with the conclusion that women should not be in the workplace or something like that, where it's just like so disconnected, and you're like, how did I get here? And so that's what this article tries to do. It tries to break down how he gets there. And essentially, I kind of liken it to rhetorical sleight of hand. So basically what he does is he'll say something that will get people on board, and then he'll just sort of pivot. And he uses this concept of the ruling class as his pivot point, where he'll argue that this ruling class is trying to appease identity-based groups. So what he likes to do is he likes to then basically pivot and blame problems like stagnant wages on gay people, or unemployment, only partial employment. He'll blame that on companies that are trying to appease trans people or people of color, or that care about diversity. He refers to this as a diversity cult. But at the same time, he contradicts himself constantly. In his book, he talks about how, if you wanted to run a country for the benefit of everyone, you would de-emphasize differences between us. And he'll point to the left to say that we tend to emphasize those differences, and that's what's dividing us. But then later in the book, he'll make the same argument, saying that people trying to argue that men are the same as women, or that have the same capabilities and interests and stuff like that, that those people just aren't living in reality. So he'll say these two things that are at their face contradictory, but it's all in the service of getting to his kind of fringy conclusions, which if he starts off that way, people like you and me, we won't tune into it. We're not likely to tune into something if he just starts off and says, so how about white supremacy? And just like dives in like with a pro white supremacy message. So he has to kind of lure us in with these little bits, these little, criticizing Amazon, or talking about how the tax system is too complicated, or that, we don't care about the poor, these things like that, workers' conditions. He talks about workers' conditions in his book, which is kind of amazing because that doesn't match up with his actual politics. But he talks about these things as actual problems, and they are. He just always comes to these conclusions that are far-fetched, to say, at best.
Yeah, and that the policy implications are the same as any Republican politician would come up with. And in the end, the groups that he blames are the same that Sean Hannity would, or that the Five would in those same situations. He just helps to muddle what a ruling class in theory would actually be. I love that, like, who's the ruling class? Ooh, gay interests, obviously, clearly. He says journalists too. He'll attack Amazon because he doesn't like the particular politics that he thinks the person who owns it has. So here's something. I mean, he talks about journalists. You sort of get into this in your piece. In what possible world is, with the vague definitions that he has applied to this ruling class, is he not a part of it?
Right. That I kind of, especially because one of the things he says in his book is he talks about how Mark Zuckerberg cannot be, he's detached from the world, and he can't understand what it's like because he's always grown up in this sort of bubble. And how has Tucker Carlson not? Tucker Carlson was born into a well-off family that then became an extremely wealthy family. So his experience is just as shielded as Mark Zuckerberg's. He takes jabs at Zuckerberg. And I think the way he frames it is in some like vaguely anti-Semitic kind of way. That's where he talks about orthodontists, the children of orthodontists, and stuff like that, which is just, I don't know. There are all these like tiny dog whistles in his in both his book and on his show, obviously. So he does that, and he uses that as a disqualifier for, clearly Zuckerberg doesn't know what's going on because of how he was raised, because he was shielded from real life implications and real life struggles. But Tucker Carlson is the exact same way. He is just as shielded. He grew up and didn't really ever have didn't really struggle. He was born into a family that had some great ties in media. His stepmother is the heiress to the Swanson frozen food empire, I guess. So there's money, there's connections. He's got it all. And I think what kind of scared me about all of this, not scared me so much as just kind of intrigued me, because as you sort of said, he's not like Sean Hannity. He is not like, he's not like the Five, but he comes to the same conclusions. Yeah. And I think the difference there is that Tucker Carlson's very smart. And that's what makes him very effective. I kind of see Hannity as this sort of oafish character, whereas Carlson, if he wanted to, I think he could be an extremely successful politician in terms of getting people on board, because what he says, everything comes off as this sort of Rorschach kind of test where you'll hear what you want to hear, which is the same exact thing that you saw with Donald Trump when he was running. You saw people who they were against immigration, and they saw his policies as being against immigration. And whereas then you see people who are more liberal or progressive, they'll see things like, well, he held up a gay pride flag once, so clearly he cares about this group. And so it's this thing where you throw out so much information that people can cherry pick what they want to justify siding with you. And I think that that's one thing that Tucker Carlson does really, really well. And if he wasn't raking in so much money on TV and didn't have this decades long history of being on TV, if he just kind of popped up out of nowhere and had these politics and had this rhetorical style, I think that he could be an extremely successful politician. I don't think that would be a good thing, personally. But at the same time, it's very fascinating. There are some people I think that you can kind of take shots at their intelligence, but when it comes to Tucker Carlson, I think he's an extremely smart man.
For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.